Very good morning to you all. I'm Lakmali with the guidance of my two supervisors, Dr. Lubna Ali Mohammed and Dr. Rushan Abhegunawardana. The title of the study that I'm going to present today is Expert Opinion on Selecting a Web Conferencing Tool for Synchronous Online Tertiary Education in Sri Lanka. Let me take you through the agenda of this presentation. It starts with introduction, problem statement, objectives, literature review, research methodology, results, discussion, and ends up with conclusion. So let's move on to the introduction. Like many other countries in the world, Sri Lanka too had to compulsorily move into online education during the COVID-19 pandemic. Even after the pandemic, the importance of online education continued to grow as the new normal. On the other hand, during the year 2020, UNICEF has revealed that though the entire world is moving toward online education, the accessibility to the required technologies is limited in many low and middle income countries. It further stated that the use of proper tools and technologies that coincide with the resources available and the perception of the users can greatly help such countries adopt better online learning environments. Therefore, Sri Lanka being a lower middle income country, it is important for them to use right tools to establish better online learning environments. Studies conducted in the Sri Lankan context showed that the tertiary educational institutes of the country uses variety of web conferencing tools for their synchronous online education, and Zoom is the most commonly used tool. However, there were no evidence found in the Sri Lankan context on the factors grounded to select a web conferencing tool for their online tertiary education. So this leads to the research problem whether Sri Lanka uses the most appropriate web conferencing tool for their synchronous online tertiary education. And this study seeks to find the answer for the question, what are the factors to be considered when selecting a web conferencing tool for online tertiary education in Sri Lanka? In order to find an answer to this question, the research aims to identify the factors to be considered when selecting a web conferencing tool for synchronous online tertiary education in Sri Lanka. And this objective, the aim, is supported by two specific objectives. First is to identify the general criteria to be considered when selecting a web conferencing tool for online education. And secondly is to verify the findings and disclose the factors specific to the Sri Lankan context. Move on to the literature. There are many studies conducted on the factors to be considered when selecting a web conferencing tool for synchronous online education, and almost all the studies have highlighted the functional requirements. Now, as can be seen in this table, Thayer et al. 2021 have addressed 6 functionalities, whereas Daniel et al. 2019 have described the functionalities under 5 main categories. And compared to these first 2 articles, the study by Mayhofer 2004 elaborates on the essential functionalities of a web conferencing tool more descriptively. So in this article, while stating the 6 functionalities, the article emphasizes 2 other factors, namely technological details and general conditions. The findings from the literature following conceptual framework is derived, and it includes performance, compatibility, screen sharing, online event features, collaboration features, security features, user-friendliness, customer support as the factors to be considered when selecting a web conferencing. With that, we can move on to the research methodology. This research adapted a qualitative research methodology as it is suitable to deal with the interview data. And if I brief you on the overall design of the study, it commenced by identifying the common factors to be considered when selecting a web conferencing tool through deep search in the existing literature. And then it moves on to the structured interviews to investigate the expert opinion on the already identified factors and to identify whether there are any other factors to be considered specifically in the Sri Lankan context. The data collected was then analyzed using the thematic and content analysis approaches, and the conclusions are drawn based on the results of the analysis. The study is totally conducted in the Sri Lankan context, and the population included educational specialists, educational psychologists, and IT specialists in the Sri Lanka. The sample frame included national university professors, deans and department heads, directors and heads of the private universities, educational psychologists and IT specialists who are closely associated with the web conferencing tools in Sri Lanka. And the judgmental sample is considered based on the respondent's designation, level of education, area of specialization, and the level of interaction in online education. Total of 20 experts are considered for this study to take interviews with. If we talk about the data collection instruments, the study collects its data through semi-structured interviews, and the interviews are conducted physically and as online meetings. Online meetings were conducted via MS Teams and Zoom applications based on the respondent's preference, and they are recorded digitally with the respondent's permission. With that, let me brief you on the data collection procedure and data analysis. The study collects its data in two phases. First, the common factors identified through literature review. Then, via semi-structured interviews, expert opinion are obtained on the initial findings and discovered additional factors specific to Sri Lanka. Again, the data analysis is conducted in two phases. First, the thematic analysis is conducted to identify the themes or the factors, and then using the content analysis, the identified themes were quantified. Okay, with that, let's move on to the results of this study. Thematic analysis confirmed 13 factors to be considered in the Sri Lankan context. Now, as shown in this table, it includes the 8 main criteria discovered from the literature. And in addition, 5 other factors, namely pricing, user training and setting standards, online evaluation, admin functionality, value-added services are being identified as the factors to be considered specifically in the Sri Lankan context. And if we move on to the findings of the content analysis, as this table summarizes, 100% of the experts agreed with the initial findings, and 40% of the respondents suggested pricing as a factor to be considered in the Sri Lankan context, and 25% of the respondents stated that the online evaluation is to be considered in the Sri Lankan context. Other than that, only 5% of the total respondents has stated the value-added services, user training and setting standards, and admin functionalities. Right. So if we further explain the content analysis, findings of the content analysis, this graph further explains the opinions of each expert category on the 13 factors. As can be seen in the diagram, all 3 categories 100% agreed with the initial 8 findings. And for pricing and for online evaluation, again, all 3 categories agreed, but not 100%. And the user training, admin functionality, and value-added services. User training, admin functionality, and value-added services are suggested only by the IT specialists. And as a percentage, that is 14% for each factor. Okay, with that, let's move on to the discussion of the study. The common 8 factors identified from the literature are confirmed by this study as well, which means the study is in line with the existing literature of the subject area. While agreeing with the existing literature, the study has added 5 more new factors to the list, and altogether it recommends 13 factors to be considered when selecting a web conferencing tool for synchronous online tertiary education in Sri Lanka. If we move on to the further research, the study has not derived the sub-features of the factors identified. Therefore, further research can be deployed to identify sub-features of each identified 13 factors. And at the same time, the study aimed only at 3 groups of experts. Therefore, it can be further expanded to collect the opinions of the other immediate stakeholders, such as teachers, students, technical supportive staffs who are actively involved in online tertiary education in Sri Lanka. Right. Finally, what are the conclusions of this study? The findings of this study propose 13 criteria to be considered when selecting a web conferencing tool for online tertiary education in Sri Lanka. And these 13 factors are shown in this diagram. And it is highly recommended the Sri Lankan tertiary educational institutes and policy makers to set their sights on the key factors when selecting a web conferencing tool for synchronous online tertiary education in order to establish a successful synchronous online education system for the country. Okay, with that, I can conclude my presentation, and now it's the time for us to questions and answers. Right, thank you so very much for listening. Have a good day. Thank you.